I'm James Pindell from WMUR TV. I'm here to talk about how the swing state swung. This is a post-mortem conversation about what happened in election 2012 here in New Hampshire, largely based primarily on the presidential race, though some stray thoughts happened on other races. That'd be great as well. I want to introduce my panel here at the Saint Anselm College of New Hampshire Institute of Politics. Directly to my left here, we have Pete Kavanaugh, who was the state director for the Obama campaign here in New Hampshire. To his left is Jim Merrill, who was the senior advisor for Romney's campaign, particularly here in New Hampshire, also, of course, involved with the Over the Montaigne for Governor campaign. And then to his left, we have Andy Smith, the lead pollster at the University of New Hampshire for their Survey Center, and also, in full disclosure, for us at WMUR. Thank you so much all for coming. We're so excited to do this. This is, last time we had this type of conversation was after the primary. Jim was here. We had a number of campaign managers, so this continues in this tradition, and this is a perfect venue to look back as to what exactly happened. I want to take a few moments to get some overall overview thoughts from you folks. Pete, let's start with you. What happened in terms of, just take a couple minutes here, broad thoughts of what happened in this campaign? How did Obama pull this off?
Well, I think a couple things. You know, it's interesting when we started up here last September 6th, I think we had our first staff on the ground. We were still in the process at that time of getting people to believe that this was a swing state and that this was going to be a battleground state. I think, you know, the popular perception was that the president was in pretty rough shape here, and frankly, you know, if Governor Romney got, excuse me, if Governor Romney got the nomination, this is a place that we might not have contested. And, you know, I think in a couple places, and this being one of them, we actually had to get to the point where we just needed to convince folks that we could compete. But, you know, I think what we saw in New Hampshire and what we saw nationally is that over the course of a 16, 18-month campaign, you know, we had a group in Chicago that was very dedicated to a ground game, very dedicated to organizing block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood. And they were fully convinced that with all the TV, with all the candidate travel, with everything else, this was going to come down to organizing. And I think that's what we saw here. I think that's what we saw in most of the battleground states. And we were very fortunate to be able to build up a network here of you know, about 200 neighborhood teams, as we call them, across the state, which was you know, one in every town and frankly in every ward. And at the end of the day, you know,
all 360-some towns.
Well, I mean, we split. I think
Hart's location had someone.
I think Hart's and Milan and Jackson, I think all split a couple. But you know, by and large, wherever there were voters that we either needed to persuade or turn out, we had a team and we had volunteers there talking to them. And really, that's what carried the day. I think both nationally and in the battleground states. I think when you look at TV and you look at the conventions and everything else, it almost seems to me that it was basically détente. And at the end, you know, we needed something to push the needle over, and for us, that was our ground game.
So, Jim, you know, these kind of forums tend to pile on the loser, but this is, just to be honest, this is a very hotly contested race here in New Hampshire. I think in the last weekend, you saw, you obviously saw President Obama with President Clinton. You also saw Mitt Romney come twice. Mm-hmm. If we weren't so hotly contested, that wouldn't have happened. So you're very much in the game. Overall thoughts on what happened?
Well, you know, Pete makes a good point. We also thought a perception issue, and the perception was that, you know, in the primary as well in the general, that, you know, Mitt was the favorite son for New Hampshire, mm-hmm. and so you know, people kind of took it for granted that Mitt was going to win. He was going to win big. He was going to win by
everyone said
numbers.
Incorrectly that he lived here. He's a resident.
He lived here.
Right.
He's a resident, which of
right.
course isn't true. And so, you know, we had to fight kind of the opposite of what the Obama campaign did, which is complacency. The sense that, well, you know, Governor Romney is from here, he's from Massachusetts, people know who he is, and so accordingly, we don't have to put in as much of the effort that maybe other campaigns did. Now, of course, we did do that, and we put together a team in the primary that I think, you know, was extraordinarily well organized, well connected, a team that we'd begun to build back in 2005, frankly, when I first became involved with Governor Romney. And so that carried us into a victory in the primary. The struggle for us then is that primary continued for months. And I traveled to Florida for a week with Governor Romney. I was in Michigan, I was in Maine and Vermont, and the process went on for quite some time. If you recall, Governor Romney came back here on the evening of April 24th. When he won Pennsylvania, he spent the evening in New Hampshire. That was the unofficial end of the primary process. But as a result of that, we spent a lot of money. There were a number of debates. We talked about that backstage, about how many debates there were in the primary process. And I think that did the Obama campaign a world of good to let the candidates beat one another up in the primary and have our resources depleted. So in late spring, when the Obama campaign began to really go after Mitt's strength, which was his business background, I think they were able to effectively define him, and that became the story for the remainder of the campaign, and that was a real struggle for us up here.
Andy, let's go through a little bit of in your polls, you have these great lines, you can see these line charts of how the polls move up and down. And one thing that really struck me, and I think we talked about this before, there is a pre-primary New Hampshire primary in January and a post. And Mitt Romney led, I think, every single poll over Barack Obama in a hypothetical matchup. Passed the primary. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think Romney ever. I think they tied once, but I don't think they tied once. But he obviously never had the lead. So walk us through what happened in those 4 years.
I think if you go back to 2010 and prior to 2010, you really see the seeds for what happened, the rise of Romney, and then of Republican hopes in the state, and then the decline of them. When the economy first went south in 2007 or 2008, we had the banking crisis. That's Bush was saddled with that. Republicans were saddled with that. The longer the president is in office, the more likely you take on the burden of the economy. It becomes your economy. And throughout 2009, we saw that President Obama's approval rating in the state was on a slow and steady decline. And it really showed up in the 2010 election. We had Republicans extremely motivated. This was their first chance to vote against President Obama in the 2010 elections. They came out in record numbers. Democrats in that election were really dispirited. It wasn't they were going to go out and vote for Republicans in 2010, but they largely stayed home. And that momentum carried through into 2011. Throughout 2011, Romney led in head-to-head matchups, and I thought that Romney was going to be the nominee all along, despite the nomination process. I thought it was pretty clear that he was going to be the guy. So we started measuring with Romney early on, and he led from anywhere from 5 points to 8 points over Obama throughout 2011. But what happened was, at the time that the primary came here, when you had a big focus on New Hampshire for Republicans and by default Democrats, you have to pay attention to what's going on. You can't turn on the TV without seeing the Republican primary. An interesting thing happened. Democrats who had been kind of sliding away from Obama, his approval rating among Democrats had been dipping, suddenly snapped back into place. So he went from approval of somewhere in the high 70s of Democrats saying they approved of him, all of a sudden he's back into the 90s again. I think what happened is the Democrats realized that no, Hillary Clinton is not going to be the nominee. She's not, Barack Obama's not going to step aside and let somebody else come in. He's our guy. He's the horse we have to ride in this election. They're seeing what Republicans are doing in the primary and they don't like it, and they got back on board. And then from that point on, I think the race was, I don't say it was largely over. Some things could have happened, but the demography of New Hampshire, the political demography of New Hampshire is such that Democrats have about a 5 percentage point advantage over Republicans. And if you have equal motivation of Democrats and Republicans in the state, and they turn out at equal levels, equal percentages, there's just more Democrats than Republicans. And then I think that's what we saw throughout the rest of the year.
Now, guys, I'm using this as a pivot point, but correct me if you have a different pivot point here, but what did you make of this post-primary, pre-primary, pretty dramatic differences, either one?
I mean, it was striking. There's no question. And I continue to go back to...
What's happening?
Well, I mean, the primary is a tough process. And, the Republican candidates were up here a lot, as we know. I mean, we had made a commitment, and I say we, and it started at the top with Governor Romney. From day one, he was committed to New Hampshire, and which made it, easy for me to work with him because he treated New Hampshire the way it deserved to be treated, the way any candidate should treat New Hampshire. Run aggressively, be here early, be here often. And so, but that familiarity also brought out a lot of contrast between the candidates. And so I do think after the primary, and then as we went on with these more debates, and we found that the debates in this cycle really had an outsized impact on shaping voters' perceptions, I think that was hurtful for us up here. That was a problem. And so, at the same time, it seemed to me, and Andy can speak to the numbers on this, but the president never really wholly owned the economy. A large percentage of people still went back to President Bush and said this is his economy. And so it never fully stuck as much as I think people thought it would.
Of course, I think the first poll you did after the primary was in February, a few weeks after the New Hampshire primary, and we're already talking about contraception. Was that what you thought was a big turning point, or was there something else going on?
To some extent, I think what Andy said is interesting. When September, I think August or September in 11, we were down 8 in the horse race to Governor Romney. And I think in February we were up 2 or 3. And the point he made is an interesting one, because when that happened, everybody just assumed, because this is New Hampshire, that, oh, the independents must have swung, right? You guys must have made up a ton of space with independents. And that's absolutely what happened, what didn't happen, excuse me. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but we actually lost. We lost ground with independents over that 3-month stretch. But because our Democratic support came back home, we were in much better shape. I also think that there are also larger environmental factors at play, and one of the puzzles that we had very early on was that Andy talked about the dip in the president's approval rating. We actually dropped more here than in any other battleground state from the beginning of 10 to the beginning of 11. In the Gallup poll, we dropped 13%, which was basically unheard of for anything along a battleground. We couldn't figure out why, because the economy wasn't that bad here, all things considered, and a lot to do with Governor Lynch's stewardship. And I think it's easy to forget, but last January, February, March, and April were actually pretty good months in terms of jobs numbers, economic factors, and you did see a lot of the consumer confidence numbers go up. You saw a lot of the kind of right track, wrong track numbers go up. So I think part of it was certainly primaries. I think part of it was Democrats coming back. I also think part of it was that Americans in February felt better than they did about the country in September or October.
You brought up a period I want to focus on for 1 second. I'll start with you, Jim. For me, the general election started. The seeds that we need to focus on started in September of 2011. September 2011, let's take a look at the world in New Hampshire. September 1st, Jack Kimball is kicked out as Republican chair, and there's a lot of animosity going on. Michelle Bachmann still riding on a little bit of a high of winning the Ames straw poll. Mitt Romney still winning here. Rick Perry hasn't totally forgotten all of his talking points, right? He's still a big deal, and Romney's trying to take him out. And you're trying to figure out, how do we totally lock down this state? What are we going to do in Iowa in terms of the Mitt Romney campaign? So the world in September 2011, what were you trying to do in terms of the early seeds of the Romney campaign? What's the game plan? What are we trying to do?
Well, I mean, to your point, we are trying to lock down New Hampshire. Coming out of Ames, the person that we thought was going to be our stiffest competition up here, Governor Pawlenty, dropped out of the race, and made the mistake that others have of putting a lot of energy into the straw poll out there, falling short and finding himself 24 hours later out of the race. That changed things for us up here. And then Governor Huntsman essentially relocated his campaign.
That's right, in September.
In September.
Yep.
So that's another point. I mean, he was in Florida. He moved his entire national campaign apparatus to New Hampshire. And so we began to focus on that. We understood and believed that he had a constituency here. He could make a move. And so we're working to lock this down. Iowa, as you saw, we did the exact opposite of what we did in 2007, where those of you who recall, Governor Romney went all in Iowa, and it was a mistake. We got bogged down there, and that hurt, and that really colored the remainder of the race. We waited there until the very last minute. We had an organization there. It was a stealth operation, and a friend of mine worked out there, and it was really out of a shoebox they worked out of. And then we surged at the last minute and virtually tied with Senator Santorum. But for us, New Hampshire was always the key. We knew, and the other campaigns knew, that if they were able to knock out Mitt in New Hampshire, it'd be over. The earned media that would come in the wake of that would have been so extraordinary, it would have been hard for us to go on. Again, that perception issue. Everyone assumed Mitt was going to win New Hampshire, and it wouldn't be enough to win by 5 or 6 points. We had to win big, and we ended up winning big. So you saw a heavy schedule up here, a heavy paid media plan, and we implemented it, and it was very New Hampshire-centric. Had to be.
And for you, this is September 2011. You just get hired. Congratulations. You're in Chicago, right? And you're starting to get instructions. By the way, another timeline, I think it's September 13th or 14th in that ballpark. Governor Lynch announces he's not running for re-election. So there's a lot of things going on, particularly in your world for the race for governor.
Correct.
What were your marching orders when you came here?
Figure out how to win the state.
Yes, and you talked about some of the challenges you had, right? This is a state that you said dropped by the largest margin in terms of battleground. This is a Hillary state.
Yep.
That,
I think the first thing, as we talked about earlier, the first thing was literally just getting everyone to understand that we are going to play here, that we do consider it a battleground state, that we do consider these 4 electoral votes, an integral part of anything to get to 270. And that took a couple months. I mean, that wasn't easy. That was a perception that had been set over the course of a year and a half.
By Democratic elites or who?
I think just about everybody. I mean, if you look at the polling, if you look at the organization on the ground, obviously the president hadn't been here a ton by New Hampshire standards anyway. So I think it was a whole combination of things. But I think the second thing we wanted to do, we believed fundamentally that this was not going to be a turnout election. That if we were going to win, especially in this state, it was going to have to be persuasion based. And our objective was to set up a ground game and set up an organization that could actually handle that. And that meant that we had to start early, and our activity had to be early and often, and we couldn't wait till October 15th to all of a sudden get on the doors and the phones. And that, Jim mentioned the value that we had of time, and that was our biggest advantage, is that we had a lot of time here and nationally to set up the organization that we needed. At times, it was almost frustrating because we got to a point in the spring or the summer where it was, all right already, let's go. Like, we're tired of just kind of sitting around and building and building and building. But, that was the biggest benefit we have. Utilize the actual time and the resources that you have on the ground to build up the volunteer operation. And the rest would take care of itself. And
how did you try to structure the campaign? You guys had a lot of staff.
We did have a lot of staff. I think the biggest thing that we did differently was actually with, on the non-staff side. Every year, every cycle, you tried to build a volunteer organization where volunteers can actually take leadership roles. And that's very, very difficult to do, especially in a short amount of time. I mean, we were in the same, position in 08 that Jim was in this time. If you get on the ground and try to build up an organization in a state in July, by the time you get everybody on the ground and offices opened, you're post Labor Day already. And so one of the biggest advantages we had was, we wanted to make this volunteer-centric, and we wanted to get to a point, and we took the long view of it, we wanted to get to a point where come September, October of 12, our volunteers were literally running the show. They were running the organization. Staff was going to play a huge oversight role. They were going to play a big role in recruiting and testing and confirming all these folks, but we need to set up that structure. And that really had not been done. We tried doing it in 08, and it didn't work, mostly because of the timing issue.
And you go from top down on that? Counties to towns to cities?
Counties less so, to be honest with you. I mean, what we did very early on was, and it wasn't exact, but we just tried to figure out where our persuasion targets and our turnout targets were going to be. And, previous turnout was some indication of that, but really it was where are our individuals. And we went out and, I think the end result, we had about 127 staging locations open throughout GOTV, and not one of them was run by staff. It was all
So the Get Out the Vote effort.
It was all
volunteer.
It was all volunteer, and these staging locations were all
houses you mentioned before.
A lot of houses, small businesses, union halls, a whole kind of smorgasbord of places. But the important thing is that there was a lot of time, there was a lot of effort, there were a lot of frustrations certainly in that process. But at the end of the game, the organization we had set out to create in September was in place 1 year later, and that was the biggest difference between what we did in 12 and what happened in 2008, or frankly any other year.
The general election, when you guys are trying to set it up, you got the Romney Campaign, just now down the road in Boston, it's the headquarters, but you had some local folks here. You also had the Victory Program, run out of the Republican National Committee. What's the structure that you tried to build?
So, having done this for several cycles now, I can say that in this cycle, the coordination between the presidential nominee, in this case Governor Romney, and the Victory Program, which is the RNC's GOTV program, was as strong as I've ever seen it. And it's improved over the successive cycles, but it was really very coordinated this time. Listening to Pete speak here, we always look at the same view. Getting as granular as you can, getting as local as you can to find motivated volunteers to take a charge and take direction and identify voters and get out there was critical for us. And quite honestly, we didn't do it as well as the Obama campaign did. You know, there wasn't the same appreciation among some for, you know, what really is kind of an old-fashioned way of campaigning that we do here in a state race, and use the governor's race as an example. I mean, Ovid had those staging locations. We had a very intricate network set up throughout the state to do just that. But from the presidential standpoint, you've got one main headquarters, and then we had 9 regional offices that were staff-driven, as opposed to, I think, 23 that the Obama campaign had. And you know, those were our phone centers. Now, we also had roving phone centers that we did, and also the notion of counties kind of being how we structure this. We didn't do it that way because, again, you kind of go to where your vote targets are. Mm-hmm. You're persuading, you're trying to get a certain vote goal out of a certain region. So it's more of a regional effort based on where the votes were. So it was similar, but it wasn't implemented as effectively, I don't think.
And one of the things that we saw in the polling that we did over the final weekend of the campaign, we asked people if they had been contacted by the Romney campaign and if they had been contacted by the Obama campaign. And what we found was that I think over 64% of Democrats said they had been contacted in the last few days by the Obama campaign. And it was about 34–40% of Republicans. Mm-hmm. It was still a lot, but the disparity was quite high between Democrats being contacted by the Obama campaign and versus Republicans. So yeah, I think that the points you guys are making about the get out the vote effort really was borne out by what we were seeing too.
We'll talk about metrics for a second, because there's been a lot of conversation about that since the election. You know, Jim, the Victory campaign, every time, I got to say, I was talking to a colleague at the station, Adam Sexton, today. He said, you know, every time I would drive, every time we would go take a camera to the Mitt Romney campaign or to Victory headquarters, they would immediately start talking about metrics. Oh, we've the last 3 days we've knocked on this many doors and we've talked to this many people, which, you know, is triple the amount that John McCain ever did, which is leading to the fact that John McCain really didn't have a great general election campaign here, so that's kind of a bad baseline. But whatever, okay. And then when they drove to the Obama campaign, like, so what's going on? Nothing's going on. No, don't worry about it. We're cool. So in terms of the metrics, what was the Romney campaign looking at as a sign that we're progressing?
It's an interesting point you make about sharing that data versus not sharing that data. And certainly I noticed that, and I questioned whether it made sense. You know, why are we showing our cards? These guys are sitting over there saying, okay, they've done this. We know we've done this plus X perhaps. And
I love how, like, they contacted 2 million voters in New Hampshire. There's 1.3 million voters in 1.3 residents in New Hampshire.
Right.
So I'm really curious how that worked.
Right.
But go ahead.
No, I mean, you know, we, like anything else, I mean, you know, we had our targets both, you know, regionally, statewide, you know, certain, you know, demographics of what we wanted to accomplish. Let's just say this: there are voter contacts, and then there are voter contacts. I can tell you that I've knocked on a door and that I've made a phone call. You don't ask the next question, did you talk to someone at that door? Did you leave a message? Did you have a, you know what I mean? I mean, there are contacts, and if you make a phone call and you don't leave a voicemail, have you made a contact? I mean, no, of course you haven't. You haven't contacted that voter, you've made a dial. You know, you may recall back in 2008, Peter Spalding exploding over Senator McCain's voter contact effort, and you know, and he made some fair points in that. Now that wasn't what we were doing. We had, I think, a very aggressive voter contact effort, but again, I think it was not. Sometimes we get caught up in the numbers without the substance behind it. I mean, that's what, in the end, what counts. I mean, that was a concern of mine, and I think it bore fruit. I mean, you know, I think the Obama campaign did a great job of finding their voters, changing the electorate essentially, finding new voters and turning them out. Certainly better than we did.
You obviously had a lot of benefit. The Obama campaign built like $100 million in terms of building up a data system to help you target voters and build an Obama score and all that. But you're playing on such a different level. You didn't have the tools, so I'm not blaming you. It's such a different level of what was happening. If you're comfortable, Can you tell the story about how you identified first-time voters in the state, people who just moved here?
To some extent, sure.
Because this is amazing to me. It blows my mind.
To some extent, I'm comfortable. You know, one of the things that, and this comes up every time, you know, last 3 or 4 presidential cycles, it's always, you know, between 8 and 11% of the total turnout is same-day registrants. And one of the interesting parts about our program here in New Hampshire is that when you looked at most of the other battleground states, Florida, you know, Ohio, Virginia, our path to victory in all those places was very heavily dependent on changing the electorate through voter registration, just as it was in 2008. Don't have that option here. It was too difficult. The clerks have to do it. So, you know, very early on, last September, October, we basically set out to figure out a way to target the people that are not registered, that are living in the state, that we think are supportive, that we need to get to the polls.
In some cases, people who just moved here since the 2008 presidential campaign.
Almost all of them
Yeah.
had just moved here, you know,
So
from 2000.
No one even knew these people existed.
No one knew these people existed. And it's not that this hadn't been tried before, but again, I mean, this is why, like, the benefit of time for us and a commitment from Chicago is frankly what made this happen. You know, it wasn't magic on our end. But basically, throughout the summer, we kept building, and we got to a point in September where, and this was all publicly available data, it wasn't, you know, consumer data or data mining or anything like that. We were able to to find a group of about 90,000 people that we had actually gone back and matched against previous voter files in other states. So not only do we know these people now lived in New Hampshire, and what their name was, where they lived, and what their phone number was, we also know that they were registered as a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent in the previous state they had come from, et cetera. We ran a couple of tests in late September. We ran a couple of phone tests and a canvas test, and we felt very comfortable with the data on about 90,000 of them. And we put them right into our universe, and we treated them exactly the same way we treated any turnout target.
I'm sorry, for context, how many people voted in the in this general election?
716 or 7?
700,000.
90,000.
99,000.
716.
99,000 same-day registrants. And, you know, the biggest advantage was that we were talking to people over the last 45 to 60 days of the campaign that no one else knew existed. So it wasn't just that they were getting our message and they weren't getting the Republicans' message. It was that they were getting our message and nothing else. They weren't getting mail from third-party groups. They weren't getting phone calls from others. And it never got to kind of the creep factor. It's just kind of the surprise factor that you would go to the store and somebody would say, well, I just moved up here from Massachusetts 6 months ago. You know, how on earth did you know I was here, and how did you know I was a supporter of the president? So, I mean, I think that was, you know, when we're looking at the programmatic elements, you know, that was a pretty big piece of, I think, our win margin.
Taking off your pollster hat on your political science hat, is this the future of campaigns?
Well, it's back to the future, actually, is what it is. This is the kind of campaigning that was done historically in the United States before the rise of television, where you identified people in your area. You had local people identifying new folks that moved in. It wasn't maybe as sophisticated with the databases that we have now and the computer technology, but it was basically identifying potential voters, knocking on doors, talking with people, trying to convince them with literature or information, and it's effective. The problem is that it's very time intensive and it's very labor intensive, and it takes a lot of time to build that organization. In the past, we've had party organizations that did this sort of stuff. That was what parties did within states. That organization was there all of the time. That was their job, basically. And you had a lot of, and I'm from Ohio, you had a lot of people that worked in government, and that their job also, when the election came around, was to put on their party hat and do that sort of stuff. There's a good political science literature that says that if you, two things happen when you make a contact with a voter. If you knock on the door with a voter and speak to a voter, number one, they're much more likely to turn out and vote, period. And if you talk to them about your candidate, they're more likely to vote for your candidate. It's pretty simple. If you make enough calls, you make enough knocks on the doors, and you identify those people that are kind of like you, even if you get somebody who isn't necessarily an enthusiastic Obama supporter in this case, but if you knock on the door and you're a nice college kid, and they say, well, he was a nice guy, he asked me to vote for his candidate, oh, yeah, okay, I guess I might do that.
This cycle was so, at the onset, was so dominated with the Citizens United.
Yes, Super PACs is going to change everything.
Super PACs are going to change the entire trajectory of these races into the future, into infinity.
They did extend your primary.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no question that super PACs, on the Republican side, helped save Mitt and helped extend that primary because Speaker Gingrich and Senator Santorum both had super PACs supporting them. But we all were, led to believe that television was going to be the way, and there's going to be this late TV that comes in, it's going to carpet bomb everybody, and that's going to really drive and motivate people. And I've always said the best way to cut through a 30-second attack ad is a personal validation from your neighbor, from your colleague at work, from your brother-in-law, from someone that you know.
Maybe not your brother-in-law.
Well, but maybe not. But from someone that has been brought into the program early on, given the marching orders and said, here's what we need you to do, and go out and be an advocate, be an ambassador, and do it from an early state. And again, you go back to the lack of time that we had versus what the Obama campaign had to really put together that effort here, kind of free from the distractions of a primary. But it's counterintuitive. TV was not the driving influence here. It was an old-fashioned grassroots campaign.
Two quick things. One thing that's interesting is that was pretty much the opposite of what happened in 2004, right? And if you go back in 2004,
Yes.
you had things like, you had these groups like America coming together, and they were going to go and single-handedly win Ohio and Florida by doing voter registration and paid canvassing. And that was the mantra coming out of the Kerry headquarters and everyone else for months and months and months, and didn't work. And it's because Rove and the Bush campaign had built up this neighbor-to-neighbor network across the country. The second thing, to Andy's point about this going back, to what politics used to be, I had a conversation with you after the election. I said the crazy part, especially in this state, is that if you go back and read Team of Rivals and you read about Lincoln's first congressional campaign, the parallels to what we still have to do are uncanny. And the $100 million in data and all this modeling, all that stuff was great. But at the end of the day, if we wanted to get the list of people who had registered to vote by absentee, we had to have a volunteer or an organizer go to the town clerk's office and get a photocopied piece of paper. If we were lucky, a photocopied piece of paper. There are a couple of towns up north that it wasn't even on paper. It was like bark. And it's, they hand it to you. I'm serious.
You have no idea. I mean, really, in New Hampshire, it really is a very antiquated system we have for getting this data.
And
It's
In most
extraordinary.
it was
states,
crazy.
It's done by a Secretary of State at the state level. I mean, it's just
Well,
At least at the
it's not
county
just that
level.
it's done by
Right.
the Secretary of State, but it's also
or
all
sometimes county
electronic.
level in the Midwest.
It's also all electronic. You go to most states,
Right,
and
right.
any of these things that come in, they pop up in your database. I mean, you literally in this state have to go clerk by clerk, town by town, day by day or week by week to actually get this paper and bring it back, and then you go out and knock on the doors. I mean, it's the same thing they did 170 years ago.
Just a little anecdote about that. There are the supervisors of the checklist are the people who keep track of the voter registration forms. And I know of one in particular who's been doing this. It's an elected office, who's been a supervisor of the checklist in her town for about 40 years. She keeps the registers in a shoebox under her bed.
There you go.
If only you could find
America.
that bed.
You guys, America, that's right. You guys are in the trenches every day. So this may be a hard question to answer. We'll start with you, Pete. What was the smartest thing that the New Hampshire Romney campaign did?
It's interesting. I thought that, and I thought for a long time that they had a leg up on us in terms of the absentee program. And it wasn't for a lack of effort on our side. They were on it very early and very often, and I think that helped cut into the margin. And that was always the one thing that really just kind of worried us. It was always on our radar. We were always going to implement this program, and we got to a point in September, probably early August actually. We had seen so much mail and everything else from the other side. That was one area that actually worried us. And in the end, it's tough to tell how it actually came out based on the numbers, but that was a concern.
Besides some of the things we talked about, was there anything in particular looking or in the trenches, like, you know what, it's August, gosh darn it, that was a good call they did.
Yeah. What struck me early on, and I go back to my experience with President Bush back in 2000 here, the Obama campaign got it very early that to succeed here, they're going to have to spend time here. And we began to notice the trickle of surrogates coming up here, and then the First Lady coming up here, and the Vice President coming up here every other day, it seemed like. And
Didn't seem like it was.
Right, but but it happened over a period of time, and I remember sending a memo down to Boston saying, we always thought you guys were going to play here, we never felt that you were going to write this off. And there was a lot of chatter that you were. We saw the numbers and we said this is a competitive state. And but backing those numbers up with actual boots on the ground in terms of your candidate and surrogate time, I think was an enormous help to galvanize the base, to excite them. And I think it was the right call as it turned out.
Can I pick up that point for a second? You got Governor Romney, right? He does have a house in Wolfboro. He has been campaigning here basically since 2006 for president. He announces he's running for president at the Scammon Farm in Stratham. He
announces his presidential exploratory committee at UNH.
At UNH.
3 months earlier.
That's right. His first trip, we should mention it because we're here, was here in this room for his book tour the second time. He comes back to kick off the general election in Manchester. He was going to announce Paul Ryan in New Hampshire, but there was a little shooting happened in Wisconsin in his district, so it didn't work out. And he obviously closes the campaign, almost closes the campaign here.
We like to call it closing it.
Yeah, we'll do that. Barack Obama. I know our station was giving you some problems with it. I mean, he comes here I think in February. He has two trips, I think, in 2009.
November and yes.
Yeah, right. And then he has one trip in February going to Nashua, and then kind of
March 1st in the snowstorm.
yeah, kind of nothing. And then what made that? How big of a problem was that really? Was it just perception while you did your work, or was it actually a problem?
I think it was perception more than anything else. I think it's easy to forget the president didn't do a campaign trip until the first week in May.
He visited Iowa all the time.
He visited Iowa all the time, but he didn't do his first campaign trip until the first week in May. And he was actually here June 25th in Durham. Mm-hmm. So we were actually here pretty quickly after. I mean, the thing you have to
there was a period there, I think, of 18 months where while he's president.
Yeah, I mean,
the campaign wasn't there, but
there was a long period between
other things that need to be done down in Washington too.
Right.
Oh,
right.
come on.
Yeah, he's what sometimes gets lost in New Hampshire is he has a very busy day job.
Oh.
And
What is that job?
He has all sorts of tasks that come before being able to come up here every week. But I think that, look, the reality was that when we go back to talking about whether we faced a perception that we weren't going to play on here, that certainly played into that, the fact that he hadn't been back up here. But once we were up here in March, it was only another couple months. We were up here in June. And then, I really think that a difference was made in this state because he was here 4 times in the last 6 weeks. I mean, you can't tell me that he himself doing 5 events here, from September 7th on, did not have a profound effect on what happened.
I'm gonna get back to you in a second. Biggest mistake?
It's not a New Hampshire-based mistake, but for seeing it from our end here, the 47% comment, and the Obama campaign's use of it, and the governor's voice in those ads, that
We learned last week that even your campaign manager, national campaign manager, didn't even know these comments happened.
right.
Senior strategist left the room, didn't even see it, didn't even hear it.
Well, we all saw it because it got played up here over and over and
Okay,
over.
initially, so you didn't see it coming, is my point.
Right. And so I guess my point is for a period of months where we weren't up on Boston television, there was Boston TV that was saturating what should be some good vote markets for us in Hillsborough and Rockingham County with what I thought was an extraordinarily effective ad, using the governor's words against him. And the governor took responsibility for it. He said it. He said it in a way he didn't intend to, but it was what it was. That's a campaign, and those things happen. But I thought that was something that hurt. We felt that on the ground up here, and I think that cost in the end.
Biggest mistake?
Internally, too many to mention. Externally, I think that I think the biggest mistake.
It can be internal. It's just whatever.
I think the biggest mistake we made, honestly, was that our whole program is based on the volunteer structure, and I'm not sure we really understood how to pace that over the course of 14 months. And again, this goes back to we're used to getting on the ground, opening up a bunch of offices, and running like crazy for 4 months. And I'm not sure we fully understood last September how to build this up slowly and steadily so that you're not burning out volunteers and volunteer leaders, but you're still building up a statewide coalition.
I want to get to open up some questions, so think about what you're going to ask, because hopefully we get some good ones, I want to talk about the closing days, the closing months. Andy, look, now we have a Democratic, the state went Democratic in the president's race 5 of the last 6 times, okay? We saw President Obama at one point in September of 2012, go one September to the next, you had him up 15, okay? The president up by 15. How did this state come into that final weekend and be one of the ultimate of swing states?
I think that we saw that after the first debate, there was a significant closure in the polls here in New Hampshire, largely because Republicans' enthusiasm kind of got back. They kind of said, all right, we have a chance here. I think that you saw Republicans here really getting dispirited in the month of September. Once that came into play, then I think you get to the point where you get back to that relatively even levels of motivation and turnout between Republicans and Democrats. And we saw that Romney was coming up through the last month of October. I'm very curious to hear what you guys have to say about what happened over the last weekend, because what we saw up and through the Friday before the election, that it was tied 48-48. And then we saw it split back, where Obama came back up a couple percentage points, Romney dropped a couple percentage points on our Saturday and Sunday polling.
Well, you guys,
so I don't know why that happened. I'd be very curious to hear what both of you.
Let's talk about that last weekend. And you guys had finished out thinking you're up by 3.5%.
That's right.
So talk about that final weekend.
Well,
do you agree with the premise of the numbers and the intensity of that last weekend?
Make no mistake, and we all know, I mean, the first debate was really a significant shift in kind of shifting gears for that final 6-week stretch. September was a rough month for the governor.
That's the 47% in September.
The 47% thing came out. The convention, I think, people felt it didn't do much in terms of galvanizing people. So that evening really, I think, got people excited, and it was a sugar high. Republicans did come back. They said, hey, we can do this, and just what Andy said. I think, and we did see, and we felt it, but we saw all these big events. But we've seen in the past that large-scale rallies don't connote movement in the polls. But we felt it in other areas. We did 2 things. We had our polling that we were in the field doing. We also nightly we had our voter ID work that we were doing, and we were essentially tracking through that as well, what we're getting in IDs, and it showed a neck and neck race. I don't think you can underestimate the effect of Sandy and the opportunity taking 2 days off the trail that final week.
Tropical storm. Yep.
The storm, correct. Taking essentially 2 days off of campaigning, and President Obama looking like the president. And
just ask Chris Christie. I'll tell you all about it.
And that was he did exactly what he should have done as president. He was a leader, and I think it took everyone out of campaign mode, and it reminded him that he has a day job, as Pete's talked about. And I think the momentum that was there was definitely blunted by that. And I think the other thing is, there was definitely a discrepancy between, I think, 2 well-organized campaigns that had discrete get-out-the-vote targets and goals. I think the Obama campaign, did a little bit better than we did, obviously, in finding new voters and getting them out. And so those distinctions, I think, in the last week, is what caused that split.
Stick with the final weekend. It's Friday night. You're about to go to bed.
No, it wasn't.
You're not going to go to bed.
No.
Are you going to win the state? Are you thinking we're going to win, or are you like, oh my?
I think we felt pretty cautiously optimistic throughout most of the fall that we were in a good place. Not that we were going to win, but we went back. We had what we talked about as the prism last September. We always fully believed that this would be a race that came down to 7,000 to 15,000 votes, and that Romney would lead in a couple of polls post-primary. So I think we all post-primary, post-Labor Day. So we always saw this as a close race. I think the other key thing you have to remember, though, is even in the poll where we were up 15, that was fine and well, but we still hadn't hit 50, right? And if you're an incumbent and you're not at 50 and you're still up 15, there's something wrong with that dynamic. And I think, we always saw that as Governor Romney, I think, was just artificially low in a lot of these things. And just as the president had bounced back with Democrats the year before, 6 months before, we always knew that, Governor Romney is not going to finish at 36% in this state. He's going to finish, somewhere between 46 and 52. So the reality is we didn't look too far into it because we just felt it was artificially low on his end. And we were still concerned because, we have an opponent down in the 30s and we still can't get above that 50.
Monday night, we started seeing in Andy's polls a bit of a takeaway. Obama's starting to walk away with it. Your party in the Verizon, with like one of the largest rallies Republicans have ever had, are you thinking the bottom's about to fall out?
No. I can say that night we felt pretty good. We had confidence in our campaign. We had confidence in what we were doing on the ground. We knew what we were doing on the ground. We had felt, even with the storm, which in hindsight you can clearly see, I think, put the president up there as the leader of our country, and I think helped him with those kind of last-minute voters. Being there in the Verizon that night, you felt this coming together, this unifying moment that this is going to happen. Again, cautious optimism. We always knew that we had challenges. Again, we knew from day one, we believed that the Obama campaign was going to compete here, and again, you're running against an incumbent president. And that's inherently an enormous challenge. So we felt cautiously optimistic, but in the back of my mind, I said to myself, 3 blocks down from my office in Concord, the day before, they just had an enormous rally that was at least as big as ours and probably a little bit bigger by virtue of having more room.
That's right.
We had to turn people away. But the point is they were also galvanized and excited. So it was a jump ball.
All right, if you guys have questions, go ahead and line up. The microphone is there, and I think there, because I think there's one microphone, so if you have a question, go ahead and start to line up. Andy, is there something that you hear in the post-election analysis of New Hampshire that you say, you know what, you just fundamentally don't understand what happened here?
The biggest surprise that I had, and this relates back to something Pete's been talking about all along, was that younger voters turned out in the numbers that they did. When the economy is bad, and younger people got hit disproportionately by bad economy, their unemployment rates are higher. They're not usually engaged in elections that much anyway. 2008, somewhat of an aberration actually, but 2004, there was not as big of the big increase in youth turnout was not 2004 to 2008, it was 2000 to 2004. It went up a little bit to 2008. I said, for sure, it's going to drop back down somewhere between 2000 to 2004 level. But it stayed about the same here. And that, to me, was surprising. It went up maybe a little bit, and that was surprising. And it was also surprising because over at UNH, and this is an anecdote, but over at UNH, there was not much evidence in the daytime of a campaign going on. There were no tables in the lunchrooms. There were no kids out with signs. There's just none of the visible things of a campaign. And I've talked to my students about this, and they'd say, well, no, nobody's really talking about this. But at night, you guys apparently had people knocking on doors in the dorm rooms, keeping track of people, getting phone numbers, getting email addresses, doing all of that sort of stuff out of the sight of the adults at the university. Well, I guess there are adults over there, but the old men at the university. And I think that really paid off. On Election Day in Durham, there were 3,000 same-day registrants in Durham. There were 2 big Obama tour buses circling the campus all day. I got accosted 3 or 4 times by people as I'm walking across campus saying, did you vote yet today? The bus will be here in 30 seconds. So that was the biggest surprise to me, that youth turnout was as high as it was, not just in New Hampshire, but in the other battleground states as well.
Well, and clearly, we saw there was a lot of polling in this race on the Republican side that was wrong. It was just wrong. And it's because they made assumptions about the electorate that the Obama campaign disproved. And they wrote again, I think we all assumed that the youth vote was at least going to be flat, if not a little bit depressed from the last time, and it wasn't. And so that's a credit to them.
I think the other thing is that it wasn't just the youth turnout. If you look at our support levels in 2012 versus 2008, 2004, it wasn't just that the youth turnout was there. We gained an awful lot of ground with that 18 to 25 demographic. It's kind of funny if you go back and look at it. John McCain actually did pretty well with
That's right.
18 and 25-year-olds in New Hampshire. I think he was at 36 or 37%. I mean, we gained 18 points just with that demographic, and then expanded that demographic's share of the vote share from 10 to 12%. So, I mean, even just going by the exit polls, we picked up about 15,000 net votes just from the 18 and 25 demographic.
And a
You know,
race.
not necessarily enough to win the race for you, but certainly enough with other things
Right.
to make that a much more comfortable lead.
Do you have a question? Go ahead and say your name, where you're from.
Sam Barsky from Merrimack. It's a question for Jim Merrill. I want to know, who do you thought your main opponent was in primaries here? Who are you most concerned with?
Early on, and this goes back to I think 2009, when his first visit was here, Governor Pawlenty came to New Hampshire, I think in December of 2009, did a fundraiser for the, I think the Senate PAC at that time. And he's someone that I liked and I had admired, and I had been committed to Governor Romney going back to 2005, but I looked at him as someone whose experience as a governor in a blue state, Midwesterner, the Walmart Republican, I thought that brand had a real chance of taking off. I knew his people. He had some smart people around him nationally. And so, our perception was he was the kind of candidate that could catch fire in New Hampshire, but fell into the trap of Iowa and distracted him from here, where I think he could have gained some ground. We always knew that Governor Huntsman would have a following here, but that never really seemed to come together for him. And then obviously Congressman Paul has a very strong following here. And we figured that would come in around 18 to 24%, which is what it did.
23.
Did a great job. But it really started off, and again, I went to that event back in 2009, and I said, this is going to be the guy, I think. And so he was the guy that I kept an eye on, who I eyeballed the people he was bringing in, and the activists that I was talking to that said, yeah, I'm not sure about Mitt this time. I think I might go with Pawlenty.
Was he ever asked to leave Pawlenty after Iowa?
I'm sorry?
Were there talks with Romney and Pawlenty for him to leave? Or did he do it on his own, Pawlenty, when he bowed out?
He was broke.
I mean,
He spent all of his money on Ames.
yeah, he was
broke.
essentially, the next morning they did a call and saying he was getting out of the race. I think they were actually $500,000 in debt.
Yeah.
They
The
put
Ames straw
everything.
poll was on a Saturday, and on Sunday, on
That's right.
our station, for George F. and I think
That's right.
this week he dropped out.
Yeah, he was out of money.
Yeah, the two things about that, it was really interesting. I thought Pawlenty was dead in New Hampshire at the debate that was right here, where he.
Right.
But that's what they're saying now. They think that killed him.
Yeah, I mean, the
June debate.
the thing about when you're being president, the first thing you have to do is pass the podium test, and that means you have to demonstrate to people that you're a leader. And when you get called out on something on stage and you have an opportunity to go toe-to-toe with the guy that you're talking about, and you back down from it, your leadership credentials just plummet. Now, the other thing, I want to say one thing about John Huntsman, because I thought the Huntsman campaign feeds into a myth that we have here in New Hampshire. Roughly 40% of the voters here are registered independents. How many of you are registered independents here? No, you're not. There's no such thing as a registered independent in New Hampshire. You're registered undeclared. And it means that you're not registered as a Republican or a Democrat. The myth is that these people are up for grabs. But most undeclareds are either Republicans or Democrats. They don't cross over from one campaign to the other. You're going to vote, if you're a registered undeclared but you're really a Republican, you're not going to vote in the Democratic primary. And the same is true with Democrats. And what John Huntsman did, and I think his campaign convinced him that was, if you run as the moderate guy, the guy that's the independent candidate, there's this big block of 40% of the vote that you've got there ripe for the picking. And it was a myth. He was like running in the wrong primary, I think. He was running as a Democrat in a Republican primary. And he could get a small segment of it, and I think that's what he got.
In many ways, Governor Huntsman tried to recreate what Senator McCain did here. In terms of the time spent here, some of the people he brought in, but the thing is, Senator McCain is a Republican that had long roots in the party, a conservative. But because of the way he portrayed himself, his military record, his stance on certain issues like campaign finance reform, he was able to carve out kind of this interesting niche. And just saying you're John McCain doesn't make you John McCain.
And they tried McCain 2000 too, right? It wasn't 04.
Right.
It was
That's
McCain
exactly
2000.
right. That's exactly right.
So, sticking back to the general election here, either by a target or just for some weird personal affection, was there one place, a town, a city, a ward that you just were obsessed with in terms of, if I get that area to go for Obama, this is gonna work out?
Honestly, no.
No.
We just didn't look at it that way. And I think, Jim said that they looked at it the same way of our target voters, it doesn't matter where they live. They can be in Dixville, they can be in Ward 1 in Manchester. And so,
So is there a demographic then that you wanted to get anywhere in the state that you said, if we get that?
I think we felt pretty good with the way, especially the way the gender gap developed over last fall and early spring, and it was especially profound here. I think we felt that if we could actually move the needle a little bit with men 55 older, there was not going to be a lot of breathing room, and there weren't going to be a lot of pathways for Governor Romney if we could make that happen. So we had a giant women's program. It was very successful, but I think we were always cognizant of the fact that if we can get these guys to move a point or two, it's probably over.
Was there a place where you're obsessed?
No, I agree with Pete. I mean, we had a kind of a statewide view. Now, there were places that we were obsessed in terms of state. Stratham, obviously, because of the Scammons Farm out there, was special to us. That's where we kicked off the
Fortunately,
campaign.
it's really Republican, so
Right,
it's helpful.
right. But but in terms of targeting, we did this exact same thing.
Right.
And you're right. I mean, we had an enormous gender gap here. And again, I keep going back to the primary process. I'm a fan of primaries. I've been involved in primaries for a long time. They're healthy. I mean, it's a good thing. And but in this process, there was a series of events early in the year where I think the Democrats were able to take certain things that were said by certain candidates in the primary, and then that were exacerbated by Todd Aiken and Richard Murdoch in the end, that amplified things. It became very difficult. And it was out of the battleground states, it was the largest gender gap we had was in New Hampshire. It's extraordinary.
And just one thing on that, I think the most interesting thing in the exit polls, I mean, yes, there was a huge gender gap nationwide, and there was a huge gender gap here. But if you look in the battlegrounds, we actually lost, the Obama campaign lost white women by 17 points. It wasn't even close. And we were plus 16 here. So it wasn't just that there was a gender gap, but I think the gender gap meant different things in different places, yes. And I think we were fortunate here in Iowa and Colorado as well to make up so much ground with white women.
We kept talking about white women in particular, working class women. You split out your poll. Mm-hmm. Were you looking more at men, or were you looking more at women, or for some interesting to see what the state of the campaign was?
We were what we were really looking at, and this was something that Ron Brownstein down at National Journal really started bugging me about back in like February, to break out our data by women with college degrees or more, or women with less than college degrees. And we were seeing a fairly significant gap there, that President Obama was doing very well among women with college degrees.
At what point he was up by 23%.
Enormous gap. And then among those kind of more blue-collar women, it got to the point where it was very, very close among that group. And that was right after that first debate, and then it split out again. So the events over the last month allowed, I think, the campaign really to pull those women back on board. And I don't know if it was, some of the comments by Aiken or Murdoch, or some of the efforts to really talk about how hard it is to keep the family together, keep working, those sorts of things, but brought them back on board. And I thought that was one of the more significant movements that I saw the last week. And that's an interesting group, because those are groups of, those are people with lower levels of education, typically, and this isn't everybody, but typically, they don't pay as much attention to politics. They got other things to do. They were worried about their families, their kids, and their jobs and so forth. They're going to make up their minds at the end of the campaign. And what happened with them starting to shift at the end, when you saw that movement at the end, you said, this is going to be really hard for that to shift back once it started going.
Mm-hmm. You have another question? Name, town.
Hi, I'm Patrick McKeown from Manchester, and I was active in the Obama campaign. We had 2 interns living with us, and one of them was from England, so that's how well they did in a recruiting job. But your comment when you asked Peter, was there any particular area that you wanted to get? I remember when we were at an early meeting, and Joe Biden's niece, Alana Biden, was at the meeting, and she said every path for Romney's victory has to have New Hampshire in the victory column. Mm-hmm. And I know all the volunteers in the room really took that to heart and felt that we were the ones that were going to be able to stop Romney if you could allow an Obama win in New Hampshire. And that made a tremendous impact on us. And just in terms of organization, I can tell you, those 2 guys that lived at our house came home every night at 10 o'clock at night, and they were inputting information into a computer. And I teach at Central High School. Several of the young college-educated teachers there were contacted 4 times on election day to make sure they had voted. That's how well greased the organization was. I was pretty impressed with that.
Was that the internal premise in the Romney campaign, that if we're going to win, we got to win this state?
It
Or
was,
was they different paths?
there were a number of different paths, although not as many paths as
Right.
President Obama had, certainly. I think at one point, I don't know who did the analysis, there were 300 and some odd different paths for Obama. I think maybe 70, 75 that we had. New Hampshire was involved in almost all of them. And that was true for a number of reasons, and I go back to the perception issue and the challenges we had. You know, we had people sniping at us from day one and coming after us in the primary. Said if we can knock off Mitt in this primary, then we're going to win this thing. And everyone assumed we were going to win, but had we won by 2 or 3, it was going to be a real challenge for us going forward. The same was true in the general election. Again, I go back to the fact that we felt from day one they were going to compete here, compete aggressively, because in our internals, we felt that we had a strong chance in New Hampshire because of the makeup of the electorate, but also because of our history here, our resources here, and that it was involved in almost every one of our paths.
Was that an effective line?
Yeah.
Telling people that this is the...
It was.
And is
and-
that what Chicago really believed?
But I bet you said that to all the other states too, right?
No, and look, you know what the other reason was? Look, people in New Hampshire, and especially the folks that volunteer all the time or that watch this stuff very closely. I mean, everybody's very savvy on a level you don't see in most other states, and I think we were honest enough with a lot of our volunteers and leadership that getting the 270 for the president didn't necessarily mean winning in New Hampshire. It was sure going to make life a lot easier, but as Jim mentioned, there are a lot of other paths. But I think it was a very motivating factor for a lot of volunteers that we can play kind of the stopper here in the Granite State.
Mm-hmm. Another question?
Anne Marie Banfield from Bedford. There's just 3 points I want to bring up that I thought were somewhat maybe a key to the Obama win. The first one was I had somebody come to my door in Bedford, and she was very young, and when I asked her who she was with, she said Planned Parenthood. And when I engaged her in Planned Parenthood, she didn't know much about the organization, so I assumed that she was paid by the organization, and this is taxpayer funded. So I thought, well, what a great way to get out the vote for the Obama administration. So I'm wondering how conservatives would be able to utilize that sort of technique, taxpayer-funded organization coming to your door for, a liberal cause. That's the first point. The second point, you spoke about the women's vote. I kind of thought the conservatives dropped the ball on that because, and I'll just give you one example. They played the contraception, and as someone who's very health conscious, I look at the birth control pill and I look at what it does to your body. And with studies that link it to breast cancer, I thought, what a great response that, is this really benefiting women? Because this is a carcinogen. And then to sit there and use that as a campaign, we've got to push the birth control pill on women. Is that something that could have been countered to capture the women's vote, or at least counter it in a way that gave pause to women and said, maybe this is okay for some women if they're consulting with their doctors, but this is not a good birth control pill for everybody. So that I thought that was kind of a missed opportunity. Trying to think what that third one was.
I think we kind of got it
Okay.
now. Jim, so Planned Parenthood obviously was very effective. They run a PAC, so it's not taxpayer for the PAC, those who actually need to show up. But in terms of those on the ground, did you see any challenges?
Absolutely. And what Anne Marie speaks of, Planned Parenthood did have a door program.
Obviously an ineffective one if they went to Anne Marie's house.
Right. But this actually was interesting in the governor's race, where you saw a number of third-party groups come in on behalf of Governor-elect Hassan, including Planned Parenthood and Emily's List, as well as several unions nationally. And there was really no counterweight for the Republicans. So the RGA and the DGA in that race kind of roughly balanced each other out. The campaigns balanced each other out. But there were 5 or 6 outside groups with a lot of money that came in, and not just on television and radio. They did something very smart. They got out and they hit doors. They did some GOTV activity, and if you look at expenditures in New Hampshire, AFP did some mail-in radio up here. Cornerstone did a very modest buy in the end, but I think the super PACs and the groups backing the Obama campaign and then the candidates down ballot had more resources available, and they clearly focused on New Hampshire, and I think that helped them turn out their vote and helped them all the way down ticket.
We're going to close up here unless you have more questions. You got another question there? Go ahead.
I have a question, but just on the comment you just
Sure.
made. The
What's your name?
commercial, which I assume was a third-party group in the gubernatorial race, where they had a group of almost, I think, all males, firemen, saying, does New Hampshire want to let other people run women's lives? I thought was incredibly effective. But my question is more national. Everybody's talked about how efficient the Obama campaign was identifying people, contacting people, and then this was even an improvement over 2008. Brings me to a person you mentioned, Karl Rove, who had been the genius of doing this for George Bush, but was doing all very different things for the Republicans this time, rather unsuccessfully. And I'm wondering if there was ever thought to have him do this kind of thing, either for the Republican Party as a whole or for the Romney campaign.
This is a great question. I'm glad you brought it up, because let's go to the summer, right? Mitt Romney's not advertising much.
Right.
Okay, but Karl Rove sure is. Do you think he's going to be a bigger factor here?
Yes. Yes, especially when we started seeing the TV levels and the radio levels to a certain extent in June and July. And I think there was a lot of confusion, and it wasn't just on our end. I think it was with the press, it was with everybody else about, the Romney campaign was raising an incredible amount of money throughout the summer. And we had always said that we thought we were going to be outspent in this state. And a year ago, people looked at us and said, you're crazy. This is supposed to be the first $1 billion campaign. But I think there was a period of time during the summer where, we kind of figured, my goodness, come September, we were going to be absolutely swamped here. And we weren't.
Any other comments on that one, Eric?
Yes, I thought it'd be more effective. And I think the reason that Karl Rove went into Crossroads and doing what he did was the perception that everyone had post-Citizens United that this was the brave new world, and that these PACs, able to independently raise large amounts of money and spend independently was going to be a game changer. And Restore Our Future was the Romney Super PAC. And I think, the Obama campaign has acknowledged that they got into this game late, because President Obama said he wasn't going to do this. And then they realized this is going to be a real force multiplier. We've got to reach parity on this. The ROF PAC for Romney, was enormously influential in
Restore
Iowa.
Our Future, the Super PAC.
Tactically.
Yeah.
So when Newt was surging
Yes.
in Iowa, ROF went in and carpet bombed him, and he finished where he finished in Iowa. Never leveraged his endorsement here in New Hampshire. Finished a distant, was it? Fifth
Endorsement here from the union leader.
the union
Yes.
leader endorsement here. And so, there were evidences of success from time to time, but globally, it all washed out. These television ads all washed out in the end, and it wasn't, all these ads, they weren't moving hearts and minds. What was moving hearts and minds, it was cutting through the 30-second clutter where the people in Hooksett and in Bow and in New London that knew their neighbors, knew their friends, knew their neighborhoods, and were going door to door, person to person, doing call chains and talking to people and winning them over and cutting through it.
We've really reached like mutually assured destruction when it comes to
Exactly.
TV ads. Nobody wants to watch TV at the end. It's not just the presidential campaigns, it's the governor's races, the congressional races, everything down the ticket. And now we've got technological means to bypass your commercials as well. It's just to the point where it just becomes wallpaper. And unless you've got an ad that is so funny and so creative that can cut through that, and I just don't see those anymore, which is really, that's the most depressing thing about this campaign. There was no really good creativity when it came to the ads. That you've got to come up with an old-fashioned way, and one-on-one campaigning
And
is
it's true not only of television, but the mail.
Yeah.
The mail we saw out there, was really cookie cutter, really bland. It became wallpaper, and all this money was spent, and I don't believe it moved percentages by any large amount at all. It
Move
didn't.
WMUR's percentage.
Yeah, I was gonna say, watch your language here. I don't like this no TV thing.
James's bonus is riding on this, so.
Pretty much. That's all I have. Jim, go ahead.
Thank you, James. Jim McConaughey from Concord. My question really is to Andy, and it's right on this very topic. I mean, you say that the ads, may or may not have any effect and that sort of thing, but do you actually poll voters much on the ad issue and ask them whether they are responding to it, whether they're changing their mind? Do you have any data that really confirms that maybe it's not as big a factor as
I would say
one might think?
it's almost an impossible thing to ask people about directly in a poll. If I were to ask you, now there's lots of commercials on TV, are you going to make up your mind about who you're going to vote for based on the commercials that you watch, which is pretty much what I'm saying. Are you so shallow that you're going to listen to this 30-second piece of crap commercial out there and that's going to make you vote for the other guy? That's kind of the assumption that a poll question would present to a respondent. And most people will say, oh, of course not. I research the candidates very carefully and I go down through the issues and I do my electoral calculus and come up to who I vote for. So for the most part, I don't think they make much difference. I think they make the research on political campaign ads shows that they're effective not in swaying you to vote for somebody, but maybe to get you to stay home. So if you maybe don't like your candidate so much, you're really not really enthusiastic about it, and you hear a whole bunch of negative stuff being dropped at him, you might just say, and I guess I didn't.
That's why
Quickly here, you guys are not ad makers, but the summer was pretty critical. I mean, the Obama campaign framed Mitt Romney.
Ads, again, it's not to say that TV ads don't work at all.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that with the amount of money
At
that
the
was
end,
spent,
they don't.
it really, it was far, what we expected didn't come to be the case. Now, when you own the market to yourself, when one campaign's up and the other campaign isn't, and they're defining a candidate and the other campaign isn't pushing back, on that definition, that's effective. When there's a particularly negative ad that maybe, in fact, uses that, the other candidate's own words, that's a particularly effective ad. There were candidates in the governor's race that I thought were very effective negative ads against Ovid LaMontagne using his own words that I thought were particularly effective. You can make up whatever ad you want, but the 47% ad was good, and the timing of the Obama ads in the spring and early summer I thought was particularly effective here and elsewhere.
And very quickly, I don't want to put you on the spot because you may not know, that's fine. When did you guys go up in Boston?
May 3rd.
And you went up in Boston?
3 weeks before the election.
Exactly. All right. I'm going to close out here. I want to ask a couple thoughts. I'm going to ask you guys, I'm going to ask him the question first, but I'm going to ask you guys what your favorite moment was of this campaign. But you're going to get your different questions since you weren't on a campaign. What do you think the pivotal moment was in this campaign? Either setting the stage.
Two pivotal moments. One was
closing
that
it out.
time frame around the Republican primary where I think Democrats got galvanized. I think that was the first key moment. And then the second one was really the first debate in New Hampshire. That changed the dynamic for the last month or so of the race. Not enough to get Romney over the top, but if he had a lackluster performance in that first debate, I don't think we would have even been talking about a close race.
Jim, favorite moment?
I answered this at our first panel in January about being at the Scammon Farm to kick everything off. Doug and Stella are dear friends, and it was a great moment. And then I thought about it afterwards, and this was more personal for me, but I've got 6-year-old twins, a boy and a girl. And in November of 2011, we filmed an ad with the governor in Milford, which is one of those spots in New Hampshire that we love to go to. The Oval is great, and you all know the downtown. And we had a full day with the governor. We took 2 hours, away from the media, went over there to film, and it was Eric Fernstrom's Milford ad, the one ad he did during that cycle. And it was a great ad, and there was a Santa Claus in the gazebo that day, and there were a few hundred people on the Oval that we didn't expect, and they were there, and so it was great for the ad. But as a single dad, I had my kids with me on the trail that day, and so they came and were part of that shoot, and spent an hour and a half with the governor, kind of just a half dozen of us doing filming and interviews, and one of those classic behind-the-scenes moments with a truly great guy. And that's one of my regrets is that, Mitt Romney, I've known him now for 7 years, one of the truly most decent people you'll ever meet. But for me that day with my kids, combining work and family with him, and he was great with them, was really pretty special.
You have a favorite moment?
Besides winning.
At 9:51 p.m.
I was numb at that point anyway, so it didn't matter. Actually, real quick, this is off topic, but I did want to say
Sure.
thank you to Neil and to Ann, who run the IOP. They were awesome for the last year and a half. We came here quite a bit, and they were always incredible. So thank you for your hospitality. Favorite moment probably was Portsmouth, the first event after the convention.
Strawberry Bank.
Strawberry Bank, yeah, which is a really cool site, which was great because it was option about 58 of everything we had looked at. But it was awesome. The Vice President, President, First Lady, Dr. Biden, they have done 3 events together in the last 5 years. So seeing them all together in one place was a very cool thing.
It was option 58 because cities kept charging. What's going to happen with that? Cities kept charging for security for the president to come?
I
The
have
New Hampshire way.
I have a mailing address in Chicago that they can forward the bills to. I'm sure they will be answered.
All right, great. One closing thought. I'll start with Pete. Who's the Democratic nominee in 2016?
No idea. Not getting into it.
Hillary would have been an easy answer, by the way, so go ahead.
I think the good thing for
Republicans, yes.
Yeah, the good thing for Republicans, we're blessed with a lot of talent right now. People who have kind of come up through the ranks here, and Paul Ryan, I think, acquitted himself very well as the vice presidential nominee. Marco Rubio has carved out a real niche for himself. Governor Christie has as well, and we saw both Senator Rubio and Governor Christie here in New Hampshire in October, and I think you'll see them both up here in the next 18 months or so. So I can't tell you
After Christie has to go through re-election.
Right, but I think they're both very effective. You hear Senator Ayotte talked about, and she'd be very effective. So I think we're fortunate to have a lot of talent on the bench right now that it's time for a new generation of leadership.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we were talking all about Sarah Palin 4 years ago. So what do we know? But any predictions of who we're going to see up here?
I think that the thing that you look at is the fundraisers for the parties over the next year or so. Yep. Whoever comes to the fundraisers as a speaker, guess what? They're running for president. And from my own perspective, I'll have a much better idea of what things look like after our first poll, which will be in January, February. So it's 2/16 already for me.
It's Lincoln Day dinner season coming up in just a few short months.
That's what I'm watching for,
yep.
Right? Who's going to come to these Republican events? Well, thank you so much for spending this hour. Pete Kavanaugh from the Obama campaign, Jim Merrill from Mitt Romney, Andy Smith from the University of New Hampshire Survey Center. And thank you so much to the New Hampshire Institute of Politics for putting on this event. It was one of my favorite things we can do. I'm James Pindell from WMUR. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's fun.